The road stretched in a narrow ribbon through forgotten country, its edges frayed by weeds and dust. The traveler kept on, his mind restless as the scenery blurred into sameness. He had been many things in many places, always moving, always searching. But most recently, he carried the weary purpose of a journalist who had drifted into rumor hunting. Small towns often clung to strange traditions, and he had learned that beneath every whispered superstition there was usually a story worth uncovering. At a lonely gas station 2 counties back, he had heard it again, the tale of a community that lived by a rule too peculiar to ignore. Once a month, every resident gathered to draw lots, and the chosen one was condemned to silence until the following midnight. They obeyed without complaint, without protest, as if bound by some unspoken force. Outsiders scoffed, but locals repeated it with the solemnity of prayer. The traveler felt the idea gnawing at him as the wheels ate the miles. A town that demanded a day of silence from one of its own seemed laughable at first, like a folk tale stretched thin across generations. Yet he could not resist the pull. What compelled a whole community to participate in such theater? Was it religion, superstition, or something more sinister hidden beneath the quaint mask of rural life? He pictured a front-page curiosity, the kind of piece that would amuse readers and perhaps earn him another commission. With that thought as his anchor, he turned from the highway and followed the narrowing roads deeper into obscurity. The land grew quieter, the fields more ragged, the air heavy with a stillness that felt like expectation. He pressed onward, convinced he was chasing nothing more than a harmless legend. The town revealed itself in a dip of the valley, framed by rolling hills and dense woods. Its streets were neat, its buildings quaint in their age, painted in colors that had faded gracefully under years of sun. At first glance, it looked like a picture pulled from a calendar, porches dressed with rocking chairs, windowsills lined with potted plants, the faint chime of a bell as a shop door closed somewhere down the street. Yet beneath the charm, unease crept like a shadow. People noticed him the moment he arrived. Heads lifted from newspapers, curtains twitched, footsteps slowed. Their glances lingered too long, as if measuring his presence, weighing whether he belonged. Conversations that had carried across sidewalks faltered, words clipped short until only silence remained. Smiles, when offered, were quick and brittle, dissolving before they could soften into warmth. The traveler moved through the streets, taking in details that stitched themselves into a pattern. Shopkeepers wiped their counters but never met his eyes. Families pulled their children closer as he passed. Workers in the square scrubbed stone benches and swept corners with unusual care, as if some ceremony demanded spotless perfection. Even the curtains in the houses seemed to fall shut earlier than the hour demanded, shutting away whatever might have been seen inside. Curiosity pushed him to ask questions, first casually, then more directly. At the bakery, he mentioned the rumor of silence, only to watch the woman behind the counter stiffen and mutter about closing early. At the hardware store, the clerk turned his back without answering, fumbling with shelves already in order. No one denied the ritual, but no one would explain it either. The traveler left each exchange with the same impression. He was trespassing on something sacred, and the weight of that trespass followed him like a shadow. The next morning the town was unnaturally still. No car engines rumbled, no footsteps echoed on the sidewalks, no voices drifted across the streets. Even the birds seemed absent, as if nature itself had been hushed. The traveler walked through the empty lanes, unsettled by the stillness that pressed against his ears. Curtains remained drawn, shops locked, and not a single resident appeared to break the silence. By noon, he felt as though he had wandered into a stage set abandoned by its actors. Hunger and unease gnawed at him as the day wore on. He paced streets that seemed to fold in on themselves, returning him again and again to the deserted square. Shadows grew long, and at last, just as the sky darkened, the stillness broke. A lantern flickered to life in a window, then another, until the square glowed faintly in the dark. From narrow alleys and shuttered homes, figures emerged one by one, their faces solemn, their eyes downcast. They gathered in a circle, the air thick with ritual. At the center, two men carried forth a battered wooden box, its edges worn smooth by generations of use. Without a word, they opened it, and each resident stepped forward to draw a slip of paper, folding it tightly in their hands. The traveler watched, intrigued, until a hush deeper than silence fell over the crowd. A woman's voice rang out, steady and clear, reciting a name that froze him where he stood. His own. Heads turned toward him, not in surprise, but in recognition, as though this outcome had been inevitable. No one questioned it, no one demanded proof. They only looked at him with grim acceptance. He was told, without hesitation, that from dawn until midnight he must not speak a single word. The traveler awoke the next morning, convinced it was all theater, some elaborate game played by superstitious villagers. The idea of keeping silent for an entire day seemed ridiculous, a quaint ritual with no real weight. He dressed with a smirk, determined to treat it as a joke. Yet, the moment he stepped into the street, unease settled over him like a heavy cloak. People turned away at his approach, crossing to the opposite side without a glance. Faces that had once been politely cold were now rigid, deliberately averted, as if his very presence demanded distance. Bells tolled at strange intervals, 3 quick chimes before fading into silence, though he could not find the source. At odd corners he caught whispers threading through the air, low voices calling indistinctly, never near enough to identify. He wanted to shout back, to demand an answer, but the weight of the town's gaze pressed him down. He moved from place to place, writing notes to request food or water, yet even then the residents avoided his eyes, sliding items across counters with trembling hands. The hours crept forward, the silence suffocating, his own restraint fraying like rope under strain. By evening, the air grew tense, vibrating with a charge he could not explain. The traveler's patience thinned, his thoughts clawing for release. Finally, as the sun bled into the horizon, a single word escaped his lips, small, bitter, meaningless. The effect was immediate. A mirror in the dress shop across the street exploded outward, shards scattering across the stones like thrown knives. The sound rang like a gunshot in the silence. He staggered back, horror twisting through him, only to feel a sharp agony sear his hand. Looking down, he saw his finger bent at a grotesque angle, broken clean, as if snapped by invisible force. Panic had seized him when the mirror shattered and his finger broke, but exhaustion eventually dulled the edges of fear. He wrapped the injured hand as best he could and forced himself into uneasy sleep, though his body trembled as if anticipating unseen blows. The night offered no relief. His dreams were a labyrinth of voices, his own voice splintered and multiplied until it became a chorus of accusation. Words he had spoken in the past, careless or cruel, reverberated in distorted echoes. Each phrase came back heavier, sharper, laced with venom that wasn't there before. He woke gasping, the sound of himself still lingering in the dark. Morning brought no comfort. His throat burned raw, as though unseen claws had raked it in the night. Swallowing was painful, every breath a scrape against tender flesh. He thought this was only for one day. When he staggered into the streets, the townsfolk recoiled more openly than before. Mothers pulled their children close, and groups of men whispered behind hands as he passed. The whispers coalesced into a phrase he caught more than once. The silence doesn't forgive. The curse was still upon him a day later, possibly because he broke his silence the day prior. The words carried a chill, not as superstition but as law, repeated with the weight of fact. He wanted to confront them, to demand answers, but the memory of the mirror and his broken finger held him back. The town was not bluffing. By midday, he noticed the mark. At first, it seemed a shadow along his collarbone, but as the light shifted, it revealed itself as a bruise, dark, finger-shaped, curling against the side of his neck. Each hour it deepened, spreading faintly outward, as though some unseen grip was tightening around his throat. He pressed at it in disbelief, but no pain answered, only the certainty that the punishment had only just begun. Paranoia gnawed at the traveler as the day dragged on. Every sip of water, every bite of food felt suspect, as though laced with something meant to disorient him. Perhaps the entire town was under the influence of some toxin, or maybe mass hysteria had built a cage strong enough to hold them all in place. He tried to anchor himself in reason, but reason was a thread fraying fast. His broken finger throbbed constantly, crooked and useless, but it had become the least of his worries. The bruise at his neck deepened with each passing hour, creeping lower like ink spilled across parchment. By late afternoon, as he staggered through the square, he caught sight of a small child crouched near the fountain, their tiny frame trembling with silent sobs. The sight cracked through his fear. Instinct, not thought, carried him forward. He bent down, and before he could stop himself, words spilled out, soft, soothing, a futile attempt to comfort. The effect was instantaneous. The sky seemed to shudder, and a ripple passed through the air like a sudden gust. Then came the sound, a series of dull thuds, rapid and unrelenting. Dozens of birds rained down into the square, their wings twisted, their bodies broken, littering the cobblestones in grotesque stillness. Feathers drifted like ash in the fading light. The traveler stumbled back in horror, his hand clamped over his own mouth too late. Around him, townsfolk emerged from doorways and alleys, their faces hard and grim. They looked at him not with surprise, but with loathing, as if he had confirmed their darkest expectation. That night, alone in the rented room, he peeled back his shirt to find the bruises spreading, dark tendrils crawling across his chest, tightening with every breath, as though the silence itself was reaching deeper inside. Desperation overcame hesitation. The traveler could no longer endure the mystery tightening around his throat, nor the spreading darkness beneath his skin. He cornered a man outside the grocer's late at night, a wiry figure who looked ready to bolt until the traveler pinned him with a demand for truth. Fear flickered in the man's eyes, not just of him, but of what might be listening. After long silence, the local relented in whispers that seemed to cost him dearly. The ritual, he explained, was older than the town itself, rooted in some pact their ancestors had struck to survive. Each month, silence was demanded as payment, one voice withheld from the world until the next moon. The chosen carried the burden so the rest might be spared. No one dared defy it, for to break the silence was to call down what lingered beyond. The man's voice trembled as he spoke of it, describing no shape, no form, only a presence that punished sound where silence was promised. Outsiders, the man admitted, were rarely drawn. The box favored its own, yet on occasion someone passing through would be chosen, as though the ritual hungered for fresh voices. Once named, there was no escape. The boundary of the town held them fast until the hour passed. Many who tried to flee had vanished altogether, swallowed before reaching the road. The traveler's stomach tightened as the man's final words fell like a stone. If he broke silence again, the weight would not land on him alone. The punishment would spread wider, taking whatever it touched. Children, families, the land itself, all could suffer for his failure. The man pulled away then, vanishing into the dark, leaving the traveler with a truth heavier than the bruise blooming across his chest. The traveler resolved to keep his silence, clutching to the warning like a lifeline. Yet as the hours passed, silence became its own torment. Whispers slithered through his mind, curling in his ears in his own voice, urging him to let words spill free. They came at him in fragments, pleas, confessions, accusations, until he could no longer tell where memory ended and invention began. At times he felt phantom hands press firmly against his mouth, smothering him, their grip both protective and suffocating. Windows reflected back distorted versions of himself, features warped, and mouths moving when his own lips were still. In one reflection he saw his throat split by dark seams, his chest hollowed into a cavern of silence. He turned away only to find another window waiting, another version of himself mouthing words he could not hear. The bruises worsened with each hour, deepening into black roots that stretched from his neck across his collarbone down into his ribs. He felt them tightening, burrowing deeper, as if something unseen had planted itself within him and was feeding on every impulse to speak. Each breath carried a subtle pain, and each swallow reminded him of invisible fingers coiled tighter around his throat. Unable to confide in anyone, he filled pages of a small journal, scratching frantic notes in uneven lines. He wrote of shattered mirrors, dead birds, the black marks spreading beneath his skin. He questioned whether the townsfolk had orchestrated his torment, whether some drug or trick had bent his senses. Yet even as he wrote, his own words betrayed him, curving towards something darker. The possibility that the punishment came not from the people, but from something older, vast and unseen, bound to the silence that was now consuming him. The day crawled toward midnight, each minute stretching unbearably thin. The traveler sat rigid in his rented room, lips pressed tight, body trembling with the weight of restraint. Outside, the town had gathered once more, lanterns glowing in the square, their flickering light spilling through his window. Freedom was so close he could almost taste it. Just minutes more, he told himself, minutes of silence, and this nightmare would end. But the whispers grew deafening, louder than thought, crowding his skull with words he had never spoken, and some he feared to. The bruises across his chest burned like hot iron, searing into his flesh, and every breath rattled with the strain of holding back. His broken finger throbbed in time with his heart, each pulse a reminder of punishment past. When the final bells began to toll, something within him snapped. He stumbled into the square, eyes wild, and with the entire town gathered in their grim circle, he let go. Rage poured out of him, fear riding its back. His scream split the silence, raw and unrestrained, tearing free with all the fury he had caged inside. The bruises across his chest burned like hot iron, searing into his flesh, and every breath rattled with the strain of holding back. His broken finger throbbed in time with his heart, each pulse a reminder of punishment past. When the final bells began to toll, something within him snapped. He stumbled into the square, eyes wild, and with the entire town gathered in their grim circle, he let go. Rage poured out of him, fear riding its back. His scream split the silence, raw and unrestrained, tearing free with all the fury he had caged inside. The world responded. The ground quaked beneath their feet, cracks racing like lightning through stone. Buildings groaned and shifted, windows shattering as though reality itself recoiled. A wind rose, howling through the square, but carried within it were voices, hundreds, thousands, none of them human. They shrieked, wept, and laughed in tones that curdled the air. The townsfolk collapsed to their knees, clutching their ears, faces twisted in pain, yet none moved to silence him. Their eyes held no surprise, no outrage, only grim inevitability. It was as if they had been waiting, patient and resigned, for this very moment, for him to fail, and for the silence to be broken. The traveler awoke sprawled in the dirt, chilled by morning air. His throat burned raw, as if he had swallowed fire, each breath scraping against ragged flesh. When he sat up, he saw his arms laced with black veins, pulsing faintly beneath the skin, like roots spreading from within. The memory of the night before clung to him in fragments, the scream, the shattering ground, the voices not his own. But the town itself was gone. Fields stretched in every direction, wild and empty, with no trace of the lantern-lit square, or the people who had watched him unravel. He stumbled onward, disoriented, unsure how far he had been carried, or by what force. Hours passed before he found the faded markings of a hiking trail snaking through the hills. Following it with the last of his strength, he descended into a neighboring valley where civilization re-emerged. Cars humming along a road, a diner's neon sign buzzing faintly in daylight. Relief struck him hollow. In the next town, he managed to rent a modest room above a weathered hotel. The sheets were thin, the wallpaper peeling, but it was a shelter, and he craved safety more than comfort. He washed the grime from his face, but the black veins remained, stubborn and spraying, a reminder that whatever he had carried from the valley was not finished with him. As night settled, he found himself unable to resist the mirror mounted on the wall. At first it showed only his own exhausted face, eyes sunken, skin pale. But then the reflection stirred. His lips moved, though he stood perfectly still, mouthing words in silence. The shape of them was unfamiliar, foreign, yet filled with dreadful intent. He leaned closer, heart pounding, as his reflection spoke sentences he had never dared to form. The silence, he realized, was now his alone to bear.